Hi everybody, this is Hero from the Birds back with another Shadowlands video, and in this video I'd like to cover the use of Beacon of Virtue or Glimmer in Mythic Plus content, specifically in the higher ends of Mythic Plus content. There's Paladins within the community on both sides of the fence, whether you should be using Virtue or whether you should be using Glimmer, and so today we're just going to tackle the topic very briefly and show you maybe a slightly different perspective on the use of these talents. So just to run down very briefly what each of them does, Glimmer obviously is going to give us access to Glimmer of Light, which is a buff that you put on a player. The other thing to note about this talent selection is it retains your regular beacon, meaning you can use a permanent beacon on a target. You can see me casting it here. And in Mythic Plus, obviously we want to keep this largely on the tank because they take a lot of damage and all of the other healing that we do will be passively applied to them. The alternative is to use Beacon of Virtue, which is a 15-second cooldown that lasts for 8 seconds, so there's 7 seconds of downtime every time you press this ability. It also takes up a slot in the GCD, and what it offers you is essentially the same effect as the beacon that you get naturally from choosing Glimmer of Light, except for it will hit 4 targets, and all of those 4 targets will then benefit from Beacon for 8 seconds while it is up. Now, the value of Beacon of Virtue, generally speaking, is that it offers a nice burst healing for a party group. So a group of 5 people, you can target the person who does not have the virtue, and all of the healing that you do to that person will then be reflected to everybody else. These are the basic ideas. You can also note that the lack of beacon from Beacon of Virtue means that you can't flash heal the tank to gain holy power. So if you take virtue, you need to be a little more careful about this. But it does mean that you can basically flash or holy light any of the virtue targets during the window that you have virtue running. So you can hit any of those targets to gain holy power and top them up. That's the basic difference between the two of them. And now I want to talk to you a little bit about the actual deployment of these two. I've put together a little chart that I think addresses them overall, and I just want to go through each of these, and these are the main pieces that I think about when I'm looking at specifically Mythic Plus content and how to weigh whether I should be using Glimmer of Light or Beacon of Virtue. The first and most important one, and the one that doesn't often get talked about, in my opinion, is your GCD usage. Holy Paladin is a little bit awkward compared to some of the other healers in a Mythic Plus setting, and the reason for that is because we have to be in melee for 2 reasons. First of all, we have to build holy power, generally speaking, by Crusader mighting to get back our holy shocks, or just Crusader striking in general to build holy power. And the second reason is because we want to be close for mastery or actually do damage. So your Disc Priests, your Resto Shamans, your Resto Druids, all of these classes can be at range or can be anywhere they would like and still do damage and do healing. The Holy Paladin must be in melee to, partake of both of those things. And the rotation for Holy Paladins is pretty GCD intensive, no matter which setup you play, and even if you're in a raid setting. Generally speaking, Holy Paladins always have a button to press every single GCD, and getting them in the right order is pretty significant. We have essentially no casted abilities outside of Holy Lights and Flash of Lights, and in a dungeon setting, generally speaking, Holy Light is not used as much unless you're going to go with the Infusion of Light legendary, which is generally speaking not very good because you have emergency problems if you have to avoid a mechanic and somebody in your group is going to die. You can't finish casting your Holy Light to save them, and also you lose out on a lot of the damage side if you go for that. I don't think actually Inflorescence is that bad, but in general speaking, when you're pushing really high keys with a Holy Paladin, you're largely going to have a setup that sees you in melee and sees you pressing a button every single GCD to maximize your effectiveness. What does this mean from a healing perspective? Well, it actually means a lot. First of all, you have to decide where are you putting those GCDs. You have your Crusader Strikes, your Judgment Casts, your Hammer of Wrath, Stirring Wings. Those are all going into enemies. But what about your healing? And what we find is the main difference between Glimmer and Virtue is actually not so much in the overall damage, though one's a little higher. It's not really so much in the healing throughput, though one is perhaps a tiny bit higher. And it's not too much toward emergency or burst healing situations, even though one might be slightly more geared to that than the other. It actually has to do with how you use your GCDs. For the Glimmer style, you will spend far more of your GCDs topping non-tank members of your group. And it's what we call triage healing or spot healing. So you are taking a look at what the health is like of your party members. You're considering what CDs they have available and who you're going to top off and who you're going to let sit at 20% HP. That's the main focus of the Glimmer of Light player. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Your regular beacon, which is really powerful, is going to soak up all of the healing, and it makes it so you don't have to babysit the tank very much. So most of your GCDs go into the group. On the Virtue side, most of your GCDs, that is, are going to go into the tank. And the reason for that is, again, pretty straightforward. Every 7 seconds, you have access to a Beacon of Virtue window, so you can game the system by holding on to your holy power for that moment or waiting to heal up other members until you get your Beacon of Virtue back. Again, 7 seconds isn't that long, so you might do a little bit of triage healing and spot healing to get people to 30 to 40% HP, and then when your Virtue window is ready to go, you can very quickly top people off. But that means that your regular beacon is going to be gone, so you'll spend more time putting your GCDs into the tank. Ultimately, guys, this doesn't mean that Glimmer offers you more tank healing than Virtue. It actually just means that where you spend your GCDs will differ. And the reason for that is both are going to spend quite a few GCDs hitting the tank anyways. The Virtue player is going to put slightly more GCDs in that direction and not have to top up the group with the same amount of triage healing as the Glimmer player. That doesn't make one worse than the other. It just has to do with where we're directing our attention. The rest of this is pretty straightforward as well. Our overall damage is going to be slightly higher for playing Glimmer. That actually has very little to do with the Glimmer of Light damage portion, though it is true that Glimmer is going to add damage to the target if you Holy Shock an enemy. But really, it's not because of that. It actually has to do with the fact that you will have less casted abilities as the Glimmer of Light player. There's a couple of really interesting things that go together with Beacon of Virtue, specifically that you can precast Holy Light or Flash of Light on a target other than yourself. And when you're about to finish that cast, you can press Beacon of Virtue, and the Holy Light or Flash of Light healing will go into the entire party as if it were inside the Beacon of Virtue window. That, coupled together with the fact that while Beacon of Virtue is running, you can flash heal any of the targets that have Virtue, and it will give you a holy power, makes it so that the Virtue player tends to spend a few more of their GCDs casting spells like Holy Light and Flash of Light in a dungeon setting. Whereas the Glimmer of Light player is going to spend slightly less time doing that and will spend more time in melee actually hitting things. So specifically their melee damage, their weapon damage is going to be slightly higher than that of a Virtue player, and that makes it so that the Glimmer player has a bit of an edge as far as overall damage is concerned. In terms of emergency healing, these are the two main differences, by the way, I think that set these two apart, the overall damage side and the emergency healing side. In terms of emergency healing, we're talking about players who step in bad, somebody who takes a mechanic they're not going to, anything that you're not prepared to deal with in your really high pushing key. How do you respond to that? And generally speaking, Virtue has a slight edge here because triage healing is very tricky business in high keys when you're anticipating using everybody's CDs and using potions, using, Kyrian pots and vials. You have to plan things out very carefully. What Virtue lets you do is take a bit of the edge off of that because you're guaranteed to get a lot of value out of the 4 beacons that you throw out in an emergency moment. Not only will you be able to keep focusing on the tank, but all 3 other members, your DPS players, will likely be fine for that emergency. It doesn't mean that you won't still flop over if you use Virtue at the wrong time during a Prideful, perhaps, and you wanted it for the end, but somebody got hit by the Prideful and you need to top them earlier. There's still lots of problems for either Virtue or Glimmer if there's an emergency, but generally speaking, the Virtue player has a little more opportunity and is a little more comfortable in those situations. Overall, sustained healing in a dungeon is kind of like mana. It's not necessarily a really important metric, but it is true, actually, that Glimmer is going to be higher overall. And one of the things I would say is if you look at a Prideful pull, where on really high keys, if you follow some of the really high Holy Paladins who are pushing and look at their logs, or go on and look at logs and select for specifically Prideful, you'll see that the sustained healing coming out of Glimmer is a little bit better if the virtue window is screwed up. So say you come off a pull and everyone's really low, overall the Glimmer player is going to be able to leverage the Glimmer healing and the beacon healing a little bit better, whereas virtue is going to be slightly more useful on the sustain side when you need to burst people back up. So just be aware of that obviously it's not a major important metric. In a raid setting, sustain healing is a really important metric, and Glimmer obviously does way more work than virtue due to the beacon that you maintain in a raid setting. But in a Mythic Plus, it's slightly less important. And along with that, burst healing is also should be taken with a grain of salt. Sometimes people who play virtue really champion the burst healing that you can get out of the skill. And while that's true, you have to remember what is it about the burst healing that's important. Is it because someone screwed up? Is it because we overpulled and we have bursting stacks going up to 7 or 8 or 9 or something like that? In those cases, yeah, virtue might help to save your group where Glimmer would not. But the problem, generally speaking, is largely going to be that people messed up and your DPS players should have held their damage instead of killing that last mob to trigger another bursting stack. So just be aware that though virtue's burst healing is slightly better, you're generally speaking going to have problems if your group is constantly demanding that your virtue be used because people keep, overpulling or something like that. As far as the dungeons in Mythic Plus, just general dungeons, either tyrannical or fortified, for which either one is really beneficial. I think it's a fairly even split across the groups, and there's probably some debate on this depending on if it's a tyrannical key or not. But generally speaking, you'll find Mists, Halls, Spires, and Necrotic Wake are the dungeons that really favor a Glimmer style. They don't really have as punishing a burst healing moments coming out that you can't deal with in a really high key. You'll get more value out of the overall damage from those keys, and you'll have higher sustained healing. Also, those are dungeons that favor a Paladin who's pouring more of their GCDs into the group and letting the beacon babysit the tank rather than having to focus lots of time on the tank. SD, TOP, PF, and of course DOS are usually the more bursty and sometimes the more difficult dungeons in general, but those ones are where virtue might shine. I think of second boss in SD in that long hallway. There's really a lot of problems with being able to be in melee, so one of the things that this distinction between dungeons really highlights between the two is that sometimes virtue shines if you can't be in melee at all times and you have to be running away while you're doing the mechanics. And SD is a great example for both the second and third boss, where you have mechanics that you have to be moving for, and they're moving away from the bosses, which is a huge problem for Glimmer because it means you can't get in the necessary Crusader strikes to build back your holy power. In any case, I just wanted to draw your attention to the difference between these two talent setups, not to say one is superior to the other, but to really highlight that overall the main difference is where your GCDs are being used throughout the dungeon and which dungeons these abilities shine in. Thanks very much for watching, guys, and if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Have a good one. See you next time.